I walked through the turnstiles at Goldman Sachs thousands of times in the past. But today, May 29th, 2019, I was walking through them for the first time as Maeve DuVally. I was in corporate communications. That meant I spent a lot of my time trying to stay out of the limelight, trying to stay out of news stories. But today, ironically, I had a reporter with me, a New York Times reporter who was going to try to chronicle everything that happened to me on that day, from my triumphs to the difficulties some of my colleagues would have that day with my changed gender identity. This is a photo from that day. The weekend before, I'd spent a lot of time trying to make myself look good for that day. I got a manicure and pedicure, fuchsia, of course. And I went shopping at Bloomingdale's for clothes that would make me feel special. I was ready for that day, or was I? At 7 a.m., with the reporter in tow, I walked into the building up to my office. My plan was to collect myself, to make sure I looked good, and to, most importantly, look at my messages to see if they were addressed to Maeve DuVally, not my dispatched male alter ego, Michael DuVally. But the photographer who accompanied us from the New York Times, who took this photo, had other ideas. She directed me around the floor, which happened to be facing, I guess it's that way, the Hudson River. And she produced this photo, which was the lead story of a feature about me that ran in the Sunday business section about a month later. In this photo, I'm depicted with bright red lipstick, smoky eyeshadow, and a deep, pensive look on my face, the look of somebody who wants to know with all her might what's going to happen that day. Am I going to be accepted? How will my colleagues react? How is coming out at Goldman Sachs going to change my life? There's also a murkiness in front of my face. That's actually the reflection of the Jersey City skyline, so it's not very glamorous, on glass in the building. But I think it's an apt metaphor for the haze of my future, of not knowing what was going to happen. That day represented a quantum leap forward in my life and my transition to Maeve. I'm going to come back to this photo, but first, I want to take a look at the word transition and how we can all make our transitions more meaningful and easier. Notice I said how we can all. What's the definition of the word transition? It's a change or shift to a state, subject, or condition, one from the other. That's the primary definition of the word, according to the Merriam-Webster dictionary. The tertiary definition of the word is the process by which a transgender or non-binary person comes to live in accordance with their gender identity, often through changes in their physical appearance and presentation, often with the help of medical procedures and therapies. That pretty much approximates what I went through. I began with therapy. I made changes to my clothing and grooming. I began hormone replacement therapy. Finally, I had breast augmentation surgery and gender affirmation surgery. I wouldn't have gone through all of this unless it was incredibly important to me. As a matter of fact, I detested every single male bodily part about myself for as far back as I can remember. I didn't even look in the mirror for nearly 40 years because I couldn't look at myself. Thankfully, I can now. Obviously, feminizing my appearance is very important to somebody like me who identifies as a transgender woman. I'll tell you, though, I think the biggest misconception about transgender people is that transitions are primarily external. I'm an alcoholic in recovery, and that is relevant to the story. In August, last month, I went on a spiritual retreat with about 24 women in one of my recovery groups. We practiced yoga, we meditated, but most importantly, we shared in the common joy that we all have now that we're not poisoning ourselves with alcohol. All the women on that trip were cisgender, that is, non-transgender. And don't let anybody, especially someone who works for Twitter, tell you that the word cisgender is a slur. It's not. We simply need another word to distinguish ourselves from non-transgender people. At that retreat, one night, I looked at all the smiling faces around me of the girls as we were celebrating this meeting. Not one of them was glaring at me with a look that said, "You don't belong here." And quite frankly, that's always the only thing I ever wanted in life, to feel accepted and to belong. I started my transition relatively late in life, at the age of 57 in October of 2018. This would not have been possible, I believe, unless I had gotten sober. In a sense, up until that time, I'd been trapped at the bottom of a bottle of booze, only able to emerge once I drank that bottle dry and decided I'd had enough. That happened 9 months earlier, in January of 2018, when, after a week of drinking rum and vodka around the clock, I decided the best thing I could do was run a sharp knife up my wrists. That's where my drinking ultimately took me, after having started so innocently with sipping creme de mint at family gatherings when I was young. The process of getting sober, from deciding to live to beginning to get sober, from persevering through the trials and tribulations of early sobriety to laying the foundations for long-term sobriety. This in itself is a transition. One that for me is actually more important than my transgender transition, because without it, I would not be here today. Or if I was, I would not look like this. I believe that any transition of consequence never has an end, because you never reach the ultimate goal. I've said this before, and it's extremely important to me. I hadn't just become Maeve. I had to keep becoming Maeve with every tick of my life, because she's not just an actual being, but also an idealized terminus, which I will never reach. But the striving and struggling to touch something ultimately untouchable causes me to seek and infuses my life with transcendent value. You could take the name Maeve out of that and substitute any one of your names, and I think it would still be valid. This idea of striving towards an idealized version of self and never being able to attain it is, I believe, a basic human attribute, the ultimate transition of every human being. When I was growing up, my favorite relative was my father's younger brother, Frank. We played racquetball together. We went to basketball games, and of course, we drank together. I drank with everybody. And one day I heard my parents over talking about the fact that Frank had sunk into the funk of a midlife crisis. And that was true. He was normally a gregarious person, but he was taciturn. Even his rum didn't seem to animate him. Being a teenager, I didn't know what a midlife crisis was. In retrospect, I think a midlife crisis is when we get off that path towards idealized version of self. Once I had my spiritual awakening in recovery, and my gender awakening, which culminated in Maeve, I was on that path. I couldn't see the way forward because, as I said, there's murkiness, there's haze. It's that way for all of us. There are impediments and detours as well, but these inform our way forward because they give us information about where we don't want to go and where we don't want to stay. If we spend too much time in these places, we experience pain and confusion. But that's okay too, because once we get back on the path, we know what we want out of life and what we don't want of life. I think people make too much out of the idea of a transgender transition, and that includes us transgender people as well. Isn't being on a path of self-discovery and self-actualization universal to the human experience? Now I want to go back to the photo. At the time this photo was taken, did I know that I would become an LGBTQ+ activist? Did I know that I would write a memoir? Did I know that I would spend 4.5 more years at Goldman Sachs and leave with my head held high? Did I know that I would be leading a life that I consider happy, joyous, and free? Did I know that I'd be speaking here today? Of course not. And that's a good thing. And the reason why it's a good thing is because I believe our expectations are limiting to the human experience, because they're so often colored and determined by our past experience. Most days we experience hew closely to a median line that most of us could have foreseen the night before we go to bed. But isn't it true that on every single day that we experience, there are things that happen that we hadn't anticipated? They might seem small, but they happened, and they change our day in minute ways. For example, it's New York City. We exchange stares with somebody on a subway. We read a newspaper article that reminds us of something that we hadn't thought about in a very long time. We make an impulsive purchase of something that we didn't even know we wanted. Most people probably wouldn't consider these happenings significant enough to say that they altered their day, but they did. And then there are some days where we get a promotion at work, or we get fired. We develop a romantic interest, or we have that long sought-after breakthrough in therapy that we've always wanted. These types of phenomena change the trajectory of our lives. Each day contains the potential for an infinite number of days, but most of us don't notice because most days seem like most days. What if we didn't predetermine what we think is going to happen the next day, or predetermine how we think we're going to feel when that happens? On this day, I could not foresee or expect anything that was going to happen because it was so utterly different from any day I had ever experienced. All I could do was to get out of the way and let the day unfold into perhaps the happiest day of my life. Sure, it was a momentous day, but it was also a day where I experienced the extreme form of being present, that I was there and whatever happened to me happened, whenever it happened, from whatever direction it came from. I assure you, this type of day is very exhausting, and I can't imagine having this type of day every single day, but we need days like these to teach us how to experience life more fully. As I have learned to let more and more of my days simply unfurl, I've become more attuned to these seemingly inconsequential things in life which really make each day unique. My experience has taught me that in order for all of us to make our transitions more unique, rewarding, blissful, what we need to do is to let go of our expectations and revel in a future of infinite possibilities. Thank you.